All right, welcome and happy Friday, everyone. This is the 6th episode of Scholars Forum on Patristicast. I am so very delighted, so very happy to have our guest today, Dr. Maren Niehoff. Did I pronounce your last name correctly, Niehoff? Yes. Dr. Niehoff is Max Cooper Professor of Jewish Thought at the Hebrew University of Jerusalem. She specializes in interdisciplinary research in ancient Judaism, early Christianity, Greco-Roman culture, and early rabbinic literature. Dr. Niehoff has published substantially on the great Jewish intellectual Philo of Alexandria. 2 books in particular, Jewish Exegesis and Homeric Scholarship in Alexandria. Now, I have to confess I'm somewhat biased because I come from a town called Alexandria, but we're not so much as famous for our diversity as much as we are a big statue of a Viking that hangs up in the middle of town. And Philo of Alexandria, an intellectual biography. But lately she has been publishing on Origen's recently discovered Homilies on the Psalms. Dr. Niehoff, welcome to Patristicast, and I'm looking forward to a very good discussion. Perhaps before we begin, I could just ask a very general question. So your focus historically has been ancient Judaism, early rabbinic literature, and early Christianity. How did you come across this collection of homilies on the Psalms, and what sparked your interest in them?
That's actually one of the more exciting experiences I have had in recent years. I have had an eye on Origen basically from a rabbinic perspective, because the contemporary rabbis in Caesarea, where Origen was active, very often show a kind of polemical awareness of Christian exegesis. Mm-hmm. And I had been used to look at Origen and see whether perhaps he provides some background that can explain the rabbinic polemics that were going on at the very same time. And then recently I came across this amazing discovery in a library. It's excavating a library, and then an anonymous manuscript was identified by an Italian scholar, Maria Prodel, as belonging to Origen. And we suddenly have about 400 pages in the wonderful edition, critical edition of Lorenzo Perone, Maria Prodel, and some other Italian scholars. And they really open a new perspective on Origen. And as I come from a Jewish perspective, a Jewish studies perspective, this is amazing. This is truly amazing, because we have now so many more texts from the 3rd century, from Caesarea, as the Italian team has very clearly shown that these homilies belong to the later part of Origen's life, when he had already moved from Alexandria to Caesarea. Mm-hmm. So we have these texts, and 4 of the homilies had already been known through the Latin translation of Rufinus. But of course, the translation is never as good as the original. So now we have not only many more texts, but we also have those homilies that we knew already in their original language, and we can use them and connect them well to the rest of Origen's works and see how he uses the language. And of course, this is a very special discovery, because the Greek is very kind of almost oral. The scribes whom Origen asked to write down his speeches while he was giving sermons, they really, it seems, they didn't edit it very much. So we almost have a sense, when we read those homilies, we almost get a sense of sitting in the audience and being present when Origen is actually speaking. And sometimes he's looking for the right expression, and he wonders what to say, and whether perhaps he has driven a bit too far away from his original purpose. Mm-hmm. So it's a wonderful reading experience, and a very rare experience of almost being there in an oral Greek environment of the 3rd century. So
Yeah,
it's
this is like a scholar's, it's like a scholar's dream, this discovery, because there's been so much literature on Origen, so much scholarly literature on Origen, that it's very difficult to find something new to say. But this big collection, as you say, almost 400 pages, discovered in Munich, really does, as you so nicely point out, give us so much information. There's so much historical information in these homilies, but there's also a lot of personal information, because as you say, we see kind of Origen in the raw, somewhat unedited, so to speak. As you say, there's points where, yeah, he does kind of wonder what he should be saying, how far he should go. And you see some of his frustrations with his audience, as you point out, in particular in this homily, which is the 4th homily on Psalm 77. For a modern Christian, it would be Psalm 78, which is one of the longer,
in the Hebrew Bible.
In the Hebrew, yep, in Psalm 78, which is one of the longer psalms in the Psalter, which might explain why he delivered 9 homilies on it, and covering very short pericopes, right? I mean, this one that we're going to talk about today really only covers, 7 verses, verse 23 to 30. And he spends most of his time talking about 23 to 25. He really hones in on the manna from heaven. Okay, so situating these homilies.
And by the way, a scholar from Germany, Harald Buchinger, has suggested that perhaps these homilies were given at Easter, and that probably the Easter celebrations may have continued for a whole week at that time. Yeah. So this may also account for the many homilies on the relatively small amount of text. So I think this is another very intriguing thought, that the Easter celebrations may have looked still rather differently, and that they were perhaps also given the homilies were perhaps also given with a quite clear awareness of the Jewish Passover going on in parallel, also for a week. And so there may be some further ping pong of
certainly in the
between Origen and the rabbis, but I haven't, this still needs to be explored. But I think it's one of my projects really to look at those homilies on the one hand in comparison, in a systematic comparison with rabbinic literature, to see whether we can identify any echoes back and forth. Yeah.
So, as you said, these homilies, Lorenzo Perrone and his team of scholars, the editors of this volume, have argued that these homilies likely come from late in Origen's life. And for those who might not be so familiar with Origen, so this would be probably in the late 240s of the Common Era. So he dies roughly 254, but in 251, the Emperor Decius issues this empire-wide persecution, which probably put Origen's work to an end, because he was imprisoned during that persecution. And in Caesarea Maritima, so situating it spatially, geographically, you were in Jerusalem, correct?
Yes.
Which is what is that, about an hour away from Caesarea? Maybe not quite?
Yes, by modern transportation, an hour and a half perhaps. Yeah, depending on the traffic.
And have you spent a lot of time in the city, in Caesarea?
Caesarea, in the old city of Caesarea, yes, I have. I have several times. And the truth is that even though excavations have been going on there for, I think, 2 or 3 decades, I think not more than 10% has already been excavated. So we are still, there are still huge amounts of territory that urgently cry for excavation, and thus neither the library has been found yet, nor the forum has been uncovered. So there are many kind of exciting places that we still hope to find one day.
And as you bring out in this paper, Caesarea was a pretty lively city. There was a lot of Greek culture there, as we'll probably talk about. But there's also, I didn't know this before, in the Jewish community of Caesarea, at least from what I gleaned from your papers, there's really two Jewish communities. There's a Hellenistic, Greek-speaking community, but then there's also the rabbinical community was mostly Hebrew, Aramaic speaking. I didn't know that. I would have thought they would have been Greek as well.
That's really a very interesting question. Yes, so Caesarea was the capital of the Roman province, and as such, it also attracted a flourishing Jewish community. And most of it in Caesarea was Greek speaking, and it seems even exclusively Greek speaking, because the inscriptions from the Jewish cemetery are all in Greek. They have only very few Hebrew words, and they are usually decorative, like shalom, but the kind of the vital information is all given in Greek. And the excavations of the synagogue in Caesarea also show that the inscriptions there are in Greek. And they also have kind of the Greek titles, Archysynagogos and other functions. And there, one of the inscriptions on the floor seems to be a quotation from the Septuagint, from Isaiah, and so it seems that the synagogue in Caesarea was one of the places where the Torah would have been read in Greek rather than in Hebrew, which is kind of really quite amazing to think of it that way. But that's apparently what it was. And in rabbinic literature, in the Yerushalmi, in the Jerusalem Talmud, we also have a complaint by some other rabbis, the Hebrew-speaking rabbis, who complained that in the synagogue in Caesarea, even the most basic and a very short prayer of the Shema was recited in Greek. So we have really a very strong Greek community here. At the same time, the leading rabbis of Caesarea, the first one whom we know is Hoshaya in the early 3rd century, and then Abahu in the second part of the 3rd century. They were fluent in Greek and also in Hebrew, and in the case of Abahu, we also have quotations of his Aramaic speech. So he was trilingual, clearly, and he obviously also had many connections with the Hebrew-speaking rabbis more inside the country. So we have a kind of a rather typical situation where on the Mediterranean coast, you have a city, a metropolis with a mixed population, very open to the Mediterranean, very open to other centers of learning, such as Alexandria still was, and other places. And whereas more inside, you have a more local culture flourishing with its indigenous language, and sometimes with a rather different orientation. So you have the two communities, and it is not clear yet how far they were overlapping or how far they were kind of set apart, because obviously also in Tiberias, in the synagogue, we have images of Helios, the sun god, and scholars have really puzzled for ages whether this synagogue was associated with the rabbis, or because Tiberias was a very Jewish town, unlike Caesarea with a mixed population. So the question has been, treated whether this was a kind of a synagogue associated with the rabbis, or perhaps belonged to some different reform movement. We don't quite know yet, but it is clear that there is some overlap and some discrepancy between the different communities, and it seems quite clear that the rabbis were pushing towards the reading of the Torah in Hebrew, and we know quite for sure that the Jews in Caesarea did not really do that. So in that sense we have, and of course therefore the Jews in Caesarea who were native speakers of Greek, of course, were also a very natural discussion. They were very natural discussion partners for Origen, and both for him to learn about Jewish traditions and also for the Jews to exchange views, defend their views, and to clarify what their interpretations were.
Yeah, that's a very important point, because we know, I mean, from Origen himself, that he had these kinds of interactions with his Jewish interlocutors. There's a very intriguing passage in his commentary on Matthew, and Nicholas de Lang thinks that Origen had consulted one of the rabbis to get his insight on the Jewish korban, which I don't really know much about it. You could probably speak a lot more about that, but
sacrifice.
And there was a practice of using that, like you would donate money almost like an indulgence. It kind of sounds like in some respects, right? So in his commentary on Matthew, he comes upon the passage, honor your father and your mother. This is in book 11 of his Matthew commentary. And he says, he wants to know what this tradition is. And he says, it appears vaguely in the gospel, which we would not have thought had not one of the Hebrews called our attention to it. And so as I was writing my dissertation, I was wondering, what is he talking about here? There must have been, among these debates that Origen would have had with the rabbis, it seems like they had some shared reading experiences where they would read the text and debate. And here he's actually finding them very insightful for understanding the historical context of the passage. And I think this is one of the more understudied aspects, at least in Origen studies of Origen, because there's only one book on Origen and the Jews. I think there's a lot more we can learn.
Nicolas Delange, and his book is really wonderful in illuminating the numerous connections. And he also argues very forcefully for Origen's intellectual interest in these traditions. In other words, that he did not only turn to the rabbis for apologetic reasons or for polemical reasons, but that there was a genuine intellectual interest in this exchange between the different exegetical communities. I guess I certainly fully agree with Delange's picture of many connections that still wait to be uncovered. I think on the whole that the relationship was a bit more of a rivalry of exegetes. I think they were eager to find out what the other side said so that they could be ready to explain the text and to explain their position to their respective audience and community. And certainly there was also a genuine interest in how to interpret the text. And I guess interestingly, I often find that Jerome, who did know Hebrew, unlike Origen, I think Origen did not know Hebrew. I think whenever he quotes something as being Hebrew, then it's always Achillas, the later Jewish translator of the scriptures that came after the Septuagint, and his translation was extremely literal. And Origen himself, in fact, in his letter to Africanus, he kind of criticizes it as being too slavish, as a kind of a slavish to the lexis, to the literal meaning of the scriptures. And so he always uses Aquillas as though he had read the Hebrew, because he thinks it's so literal that you could use it as though it was Hebrew, which is kind of an interesting statement from a scholarly point of view. And so he was, in that sense, his engagement with the rabbis was limited because he could not follow the Hebrew text, and he could not engage with them on the Hebrew level of things. But certainly Jerome came afterwards, and he was obviously an expert in the Hebrew. And I find that sometimes he comes after Origen and he's aware of his engagement with the rabbis and the Hebrew speakers, and he provides the reasons for Origen's exegetical decisions, this time providing also some Hebrew arguments and arguments from the scripture in their original language to supplement Origen and to kind of further strengthen his argument in this rivalry of exegesis between the different communities.
Okay, so we've got a sense of what's going on in Caesarea at the time Origen was delivering these homilies. And one thing, perhaps, before we jump right into homily 4, is when you read these, like you mentioned at the beginning, this collection is so important because most of the homilies we have from Origen are in the Latin translation. We do have a sizable
Jeremiah, the homilies on Jeremiah are in Greek. That's a huge corpus.
Yep, and that's about the exception. Besides his homily on 1 Samuel.
Yes.
But other than that, this adds substantially to our knowledge of Origen's preaching. And I don't know what you think, but these homilies don't differ that much from his biblical commentaries. It's lemma by lemma, critical exegesis. In his commentaries, he can really go off on digressions and testing hypotheses, which really don't emerge from these homilies quite as much. But still, the manner in which he approaches the text, verse by verse, is quite similar. So these are not at all like we would encounter a homily today in, say, a Roman Catholic church or a Protestant sermon. So that is one of the striking features, I think, of Origen's preaching, is that when we use the word preaching or homily, we should probably think of this more in its literal context of like a formal discourse almost. Would you agree with that kind of assessment of these homilies?
Yes, I think that's a very important point. I think we have to recall that on several occasions in the homilies, Origen refers to the fact that the text has just been read aloud.
Yes.
And so I think he very much sees his homily as an exposition of the text that has just been read aloud, as a kind of deepening of the understanding and the illumination of the text. And you're absolutely right that he proceeds in a similar way, namely he's very oriented towards the text, and he goes into some details, not quite as much as in the commentaries. It's not for a specialized audience, but for a more general audience. And I think the homilies on the so-called Old Testament, they were also attended by non-Christians, or at least by those who had not yet received their full initiation into the faith. So it was a much more mixed audience than the homilies on the New Testament text. And he does, even in the new homilies, there is one, I can't remember now which homily it is. I think maybe it's the first one on Psalm 77, where he even introduces some text critical arguments. And he has a kind of notes that in fact Matthew hasn't preserved the right reference to the psalm, and he thinks that it's Isaiah, and a quotation from Isaiah. And of course, this is a huge problem for him, and he has a wonderful solution.
Yes, he does.
And he says it was a scribe. A scribe didn't quite understand it, and he quite didn't get it, and so he himself put in the name of Isaiah, but it wasn't Matthew's doing. So that's his solution, and we get a wonderful insight here into these critical engagements with the text. And on this particular point, I think it's also really interesting that we know from Jerome that Porphyry, the pagan critic, he actually made this point, and he complained that Matthew was so silly that he quoted something under the wrong name. And so this is kind of very intriguing as well, Because when we look at Origen and his homilies, I think, and his whole kind of exegetical project, we have to take into account not only the Jews, both the Greek-speaking and the Hebrew-speaking Jews in his immediate environment in Caesarea, but I think we also have to take into account the pagan environment. And Porphyry, as we know from some fragmentary evidence, apparently made it at the beginning of his career, maybe even in his youth, from Tyre to Caesarea to meet Origen and to engage with him. And I'm kind of intrigued. Nobody really knows for how long Porphyry stayed. Nobody knows what happened between Origen and Porphyry. It seems that the end result was that Porphyry turned away to pagan culture and became one of the harshest critics of Christianity. Mm-hmm. But I wonder whether there may have been enough time for Porphyry in Caesarea to make this point and actually say that, when he was introduced to the Gospels, that he said, well, Matthew obviously didn't know what he was quoting, mm-hmm. and that perhaps Origen in his homily may in fact have responded not only to some abstract critical problem, but perhaps to something that his pagan visitor had in fact mentioned, and his audience was obviously concerned. How come that we have this flaw in our scriptures? And he felt encouraged to respond to this and to seek a solution.
That's an interesting argument. I hadn't thought of that. Porphyry would have been pretty young at the time.
Yes, very young.
He does recount a time that Origen visited Plotinus in his school in Rome, and Plotinus seemingly blushed and gave quite a bit of deference to Origen because Origen was older.
But is that the same Origen? I'm not so sure.
Yeah, that's a debate. Yeah, that's a debate.
There's this huge debate whether this in fact was the same Origen, yeah. And I'm not so sure because I think
that's true.
So in the fragments that are quoted by Eusebius, he's so negative about and so critical about Origen that I find it rather difficult to think that in a different context he may just have mentioned some Origen. I'm not so sure. Yeah. I haven't done all the research on this point, but I think we cannot simply assume that it's just it's the same.
Yeah, that's right. In the homily that you're talking about, the first homily in Psalm 77, Origen, like you say, he alludes to a scribe who didn't know that Asaph, he didn't recognize the name Asaph. So he just attributes it because in the text of Matthew, it's Matthew 13:35, and it says, in order that what was spoken by the prophet may be fulfilled, I will open my mouth in parables and utter problems from the beginning. And Origen says, well, that's silly because Jesus here is quoting this psalm, which according to the inscription is a psalm of the prophet Asaph. But then he goes after he discusses this text critical approach of comparing the Hebrew and the ektosis, the Greek versions. He targets Marcion, and he
doesn't quote the Hebrew. He doesn't quote the Hebrew there.
That's right.
He speaks about the different versions.
Yeah, but his target there afterwards is Marcion, and he blames Marcion for taking the philological work upon himself without the proper training and without the proper grounding in faith, he says. That is one of the more fascinating discussions. What his audience would have been thinking as he's talking about that, they probably would have been saying, who cares? But I don't know. It's a very fascinating discussion. Okay.
But in one of the other homilies, Origen also seems to suggest that he himself was closer to Gnostic thoughts than we usually assume. I can't remember the exact expression now, but he says something about Valentine, and then he says, how does he put it? As in earlier times we were familiar or something. It suddenly this is another of the kind of really precious autobiographical pieces, snippets that we get from the new homilies, that it may have been that he was closer to it, as also his patron Ambrosius. Yep. He had been a Gnostic, and he actually asked Origen to write all these things at the beginning, at least, for example, the commentary on John, with the precise aim of countering Heracleon's Gnostic commentary that was already in existence before. And it seems that perhaps Origen also was a bit more like Ambrosius in that way, that he was a bit more familiar with these ideas than he admitted later.
Yeah, there's a passage. There's a passage, I think, in the second homily on Psalm 77. Lorenzo Peroni does a nice job of talking about this passage. I'm not going to look for it, but he talks about a time when Gnostic groups flourished, or he doesn't say Gnostic. I think he says heresies flourished because the church lacked adequate teachers to form the community. Peroni does a nice job of bringing this out. It's kind of, you see here Origen reflecting on an earlier time in his life, perhaps when, probably back in Alexandria, where there were pretty sizable Gnostic communities, I think. At least they held some degree of authority and persuasion. But then he finally says, well, we've got good teachers now, so they're not quite as prevalent as they used to be. Yeah, there's all kinds of very interesting autobiographical information in here. How about we, I've really steered this conversation aside from the fourth homily on Psalm 77. So how about we get to that?
Yes. Yes. So the homily that we want to focus on today is the fourth homily on the 77th Psalm, according to the Septuagint, and it contains a fascinating passage about the Olympic Games. And of course, this is another pearl in the new homilies. Origen starts out by reprimanding his community not to care too much about bodily food and luxury and pleasure. But then he actually makes a very intriguing step, which discloses his great passion about the Hellenic tradition, and I think is really, rather than just avoiding it and rather than just polemicizing against it, as we know very well from Tertullian and others, he actually positions himself in the role of these famous trainers at Olympia. And I guess I will just read the most central passage, and then we can discuss it. So this is what Origen says to his audience in Caesarea. He starts with a quotation from Paul. Have you forgotten that for you the wrestling is not against someone of blood and flesh, but against someone of great nature and size and number, against the principalities, not against the subordinate, but against the rulers, against the authorities, not against someone insignificant, but against someone in power, against the world rulers, not of parts of the world, but those ruling the world, namely against the world rulers even of this darkness. Moreover, Origen now says, pay attention and listen so that you may learn to nourish yourself with athletic food. Remember, not with all the dainties and cakes that he wants them to avoid. Because you wrestle against the spiritual hosts of wickedness in the heavenly realm. Well then, fight, for nobody is crowned with the wreath of victory if he does not train according to custom. Let athletic food be received as part of the customary training together with the exercises. Or do you not know what is reported about those competitions which are called the great games? At these games are present those who have been sent by the judges of the Pan-Hellenic Games, who watch closely how the athletes eat. And inasmuch as they are present with those training and check whether the training is according to the law and the art, thus they are also present with the athletes, even when they feed. They speak plainly to those nurturing themselves as competitors and say exactly at the time of their feeding, you eat well, you eat food of excellent quality, you have high hopes, thus referring to the food itself. But afterwards, those athletes, take upon themselves hard work, and now he quotes from Paul, in order to gain a perishable wreath, namely the work involved of following a strict diet, the work of training and of manifold travels and of marching on the road. And among them are often men who have grown a beard and are beaten and accept to be hit by the supervisors, receiving blows on their back and stomach. You, however, train without agreeing to submit to the blows which God, wishing to turn you into an athlete, administers to you through scorches. You are not ready to give yourself into the athletic diet, but instead one day frequently passes by while you remain without food for your soul. Or why do I say one day? For even a second and a third and a fourth day, and even this is not enough, but often 6 and even 7 days pass by you, with the result that you are fed on only one day. But whenever you can, enter the house of the Lord and receive your spiritual food so that you may be directed towards salvation, but not throughout the 7 days, but rather on the several days of the Lord. Nowadays, however, some altogether look down on this and remain without food throughout the whole year, but they come for the so-called days of Passover, when they will be fed. And this here is the reference to Easter. Do you think that those are able to compete and fight against the spiritual hosts of wickedness when they thus neglect their own food? For those cannot gain strength who do not take strengthening foods.
What a lovely passage.
Yes.
So you, in your paper, you really hone in on the judges of the Pan-Hellenic games, and you argue that here we see Origen actually show, well, he kind of mocks them on the one hand, and he says,
Oh, yes. Oh, yes.
And so, these athletes, they train for this perishable wreath that doesn't mean anything, but we train for this eternal reward. And you kind of argue, you don't kind of argue, you do argue that Origen situates himself then in the place of these Pan-Hellenic judges that oversee the training. Can you talk a little bit about that? Because your paper is very fascinating. This, I have to say, this was the first homily I read of the collection. And it was also my very first peer-reviewed publication. So this homily is near and dear.
Yes, I remember. Yes.
So I really appreciate it. So talk a little bit about that. The judges.
Yes. Yeah. Now, usually what scholars do when they read such a passage, they say, okay, we have this mocking here of the Hellenic, Pan-Hellenic judges. So we must have a kind of a complete dichotomy. Over there, the pagans, and we hate them, and here are the Christians, and we do much better than they ever could dream of doing. But I think that this is kind of a mistaken approach, because if we place Origen in a Greek-speaking context of the 3rd century, we see that many pagans, at the same time as Origen wrote, were also engaging critically, mockingly, creatively, in a lively way with these traditions. And the Olympic Games were a kind of a myth, really a mythological theme that any Greek intellectual, any Greek person of culture would have some kind of attitude to and engage with and find it interesting. Starting from Plato, who compares some training of the soul to the preparation of the preparatory training at Elis and Philo, and everybody mentions the mythological training as the expression of the kind of greatest effort a human person can make. This is kind of the symbol of the Olympic Games. Now, the Pan-Hellenic judges at the Olympic Games, they were famous for their authority because they were there in the preliminary training before the official Olympic Games started. They were there to organize and also judge the month of training at Elis before that started. And this was an obligatory training. And anybody who wanted to participate in the real Olympic Games had to participate in the preliminary training, which took place a whole month. And there are, by the way, also some stories of boxers who didn't make it because they made money going to other competitions in the meantime, and they were not admitted after they missed this preliminary training. they were no longer admitted. So the judges had this immense prestige in the ancient world of having a great authority over a crucial event in the cultural, political, and sports life, of course, of ancient Greece. And in contemporary of Origen, or other Greek authors in the 3rd century engaged also exactly with this myth of the Pan-Hellenic judges. And in my paper, I compared Origen's mocking strategy to Philostratus, because he does exactly the same. Philostratus used, in a very similar way as Origen, used the Pan-Hellenic games to situate himself within the Hellenic tradition. And he also mocks the judges a bit, but basically, just like Origen, to say that he will do a better job. And I think both of them have a fascination for this mythological Greek tradition, which on the one hand, they find a bit funny and they mock it a bit. But on the other hand, they simply want to do exactly the same, only in a better way. So Philostratus argues that he is better in literature, and as a writer, as an author, he does a better job. And Origen says that he's a better teacher in the community, in his community. So let me just see whether I can. So here, for example, so Philostratus says, so he mentions the Hellenic at Olympia. He mentions it as a story, so he too relates to it as a tradition that he has received, a literary tradition. And he speaks about the tools that those judges have to exercise their authority. And he speaks about the Hellenics. They are in charge of the training and improvising to fit the occasion. And where the whip is raised against the trainer, if he's not anything to contrary to what is the Hellenic order. And then he says, this is all I have to say concerning this system of training. And if we follow the advice I have given, we will demonstrate that athletic training is a variety of wisdom, and we should give strength to the athletes, and the stadia will regain their youth thanks to the good training practices. So in other words, Philostratus takes the mythological judges as kind of paradigms of a training that is personal, that is spontaneous, and that does not follow the absolutely strict rules. Mm-hmm. And then he says, well, I am doing it one step better in the field of literature, in the field of kind of intellectual, and in the field of intellectual activity. Mm-hmm. And this, I argue, is exactly the same as Origen, because he tells his audience that they should be good athletes, and he, in particular, he tells them to avoid all the dandy foods, because they must train themselves as real athletes and eat only the kind of the precise food that will be good for their spiritual training, and that does not contain cookies and fine breads and all that. And then he also says, just like the athletes that are reprimanded and kind of organized and directed by the judges at Elis at the Olympic Games, so you must receive my authority, and of course even more God's authority, and you must receive scorches from God in this training. So he obviously speaks to an audience who admires the Olympic Games, and he tries to engage them and to tell them, if you come to the church, if you come every day to the church or every Sunday to the church, and you submit to a rigorous spiritual training in the spirit of Christ, then you will in fact be a more perfect athlete than those mythological ones, and your prize will be even better and more glorious and more important and more worthy than those prizes that the Olympic winners took home. And of course, they became so famous in their local cities that they had a pension and they had their prestige guaranteed for the rest of their lives. So Origen is engaging those people in his audience, and we know that Caesarea was a site in the 3rd century of athletic games, and people came from all over, from what is today the area of Turkey. They came, and apparently also from Egypt. They came to participate in the games in Caesarea. And Origen was facing a very concrete competition. Just a few meters next to his church, there were these training grounds, and there were the great stadium where the games would take place once in a few years. And the competition was very hard, and he was fighting hard to get the audience from the sport grounds to his church. And the way he does it is by kind of inscribing himself into that tradition and saying, well, you you are just a wonderful Greek athlete if you come to the church and listen to me. And this is even a more rigorous training where you can prove yourself even more than you could if you went to the sport grounds. And so I think the Greek tradition here is so vibrant, and Origen kind of integrates it rhetorically into his speech, and really wants to argue that Easter is like the Olympic Games, but you can't just come only for Easter. You have to prepare yourself throughout the whole year, and kind of build up towards these Olympic Games in once a year. So I think both in terms of the locale and in terms of the time, he is using the Olympic tradition to place his church both in the kind of the calendar and also physically as a sports ground that is in fact better than the one down the road where people could in fact train physically. So I think this is a very clever move to negotiate the Greek tradition and to basically to integrate it and to integrate the people who were enthusiastic about it.
Yeah, I learned so much from your paper, because when I read this homily, I didn't pick up on the allusion to the Pan-Hellenic judges, the Hellenodikon. First of all, I couldn't really find it in TLG.
Because he spells it slightly differently. The most common spelling is one vowel is different.
Okay.
So that's what makes it perhaps. So that's perhaps why one misses it.
Because I focus most of my attention on trophy, the nourishment that the athletes undertake, which Origen seems to use as an analogy for the spiritual nourishment in the scripture.
Yes, the manna. Of course, that's the key connection to the biblical text also, because he's exegeting a psalm that mentions the manna, the spiritual, the physical and spiritual food of the Israelites on the Exodus. So that's his connecting point. Yes, and he connects it, of course, already through Paul's famous passage in Corinthians about the athletic games there, which I think also there is actually Paul speaks there about the games in Corinth that apparently had already been renewed by his time, and he just like Origen, he's speaking to people who were probably visiting the games and sitting in the audience, and he's kind of doing the same thing. He says, well, this is just a perishable wreath my wreath is a real one.
And your take on East Kyriakon and the Pascha that Origen references here. You're working with Harold Buchinger, correct? His work on the Eucharist in these homilies. I did not pick up. I mean, I caught the reference to the Easter, the Pascha, but the way you situate this in comparison to the games, so the athletes go through this period of formal training for this ultimate goal. I did not pick up on how Origen is using that actually here as a model for the Christian, who he's trying to get to understand that Easter is our big festal celebration and we have to train ourselves for. I didn't pick up on that connection. I thought that was a very fascinating observation. And as you point out in your paper here, we see an early allusion to what might be like a Triduum or a Holy Week of preparation for Easter Sunday. Can you talk a little bit about that? I thought that was very interesting.
I don't have much to add beyond Buchinger's work on the liturgy and the liturgical history, but I think the use of the Olympic training ground here, the training period for the preparation of the Easter, is basically all based also in Buchinger's analysis on the last few lines of the passage that I read out, when he speaks about the different options. You could come either only during the Easter, you could come during the so-called days of Easter, and here again, days of Easter, this sounds like a longer period. Mm-hmm. And the several days of the Lord. So obviously we have here a longer period, and I think Origen here seems to be speaking both about this preparatory period preparing towards Easter, and also perhaps even more the whole year is leading up to this Easter event as the prime holiday, I think, in as far as he conceives it. So this is, I guess, from the point of view of Christianity, this is also a very interesting homily. Obviously, at a time when Christmas, the modern greatest holiday, is not yet so central, yeah. and the date of which is also not yet fixed so clearly. But the Passover is fixed, and the Passover is obviously Origen's most important Christian holiday. Mm-hmm. So this is also really interesting from the point of view of Christian liturgy. That's the balance was still very different. The focus was on Passover.
And in your paper, don't you make a connection with the Caesarean Jewish community, who
yes.
also, the rabbis also applied imagery of the games, of the athletic contests. And there's also the corresponding Passover time of the Jewish community. Can you say a little bit about that?
Yes, yes, I'm delighted to. I really think I recommend to everybody who hears this conversation that really I strongly recommend to always look also at the rabbis in connection with the Origen, because this gives us a much more complete picture of his environment. And regarding the Olympic Games or athletic training more generally, because the rabbis do not mention specifically the Olympic Games or the judges at the Olympic Games. But we have here two religious elites who are dealing with communities who were immersed in a very broad sense in Greek culture. And it seems that both elites, both religious elites, had an interest and needed to confront the daily practices and the immersion of their communities in Greek culture. Mm-hmm. So first of all, it's really fascinating that the rabbis in their first document, the Mishnah, redacted around 200, that is just before Origen, gave about 40 years or something before Origen gave his homily. They regulated that on the Shabbat you should not engage in athletic training, which is kind of a really cute observation, because obviously it assumes that the rest of the days of the week the Jews did train, and that the rabbis had no way of, even if they wanted to, they had no way of enforcing a complete abstention from athletic training. So they were happy to reach a point where Jews would not train on the Shabbat. But the very fact, of course, that we have to mention this in particular in the Mishnah also shows that there were many Jews at that time who were training also on the Shabbat. So the rabbis tried to put their foot down and say, not on the Shabbat. The Shabbat is a day free of athletic training. So this again shows that there were many Jews who were engaged in the games and in the athletic training as much as the Christians were. And we can even imagine that the audience of Origen's homily and the Jewish community that the rabbis were responsible for, that they were training together, and then we have Origen reacting to this in his homily, and we have the rabbis reacting to this in their documents. Now for the Passover celebrations, the rabbis chose a different Hellenic paradigm. And I think this is also so important to see that the Hellenic tradition, of course, was not one uniform thing. So you could always choose different aspects and different parts. So the rabbis did not talk about the Passover in terms of athletic games or Olympic games, but they did actually use the tradition of the philosophical symposium to set up a completely new, dramatically new ritual for the Passover evening. This became a philosophical symposium where the families and their friends and extended family would come and discuss the history and the biblical text and the history of the Exodus, and they would also eat, like in any good symposium. They would eat special and festive foods, and thus have both a bodily and a spiritual experience that would kind of complement each other. Very much like Plutarch, who will often give you the beginning of a sympathetic conversation by pointing to the food that is now being served, and the food is the starting point. Very often the wine or something is the starting point for a philosophical discussion. So this is very much what the rabbis did. They presented foods that in fact we called the Exodus, and then they also developed some ritual texts that became later the Haggadah. So they opted for a different Hellenic option to celebrate the Passover. That was the symposium, while Origen compared it to the Olympic Games. The last point that we can really that I would like to mention about the rabbis is that we also have beautiful interpretations of biblical texts which use the athletic games as a metaphor. And one of the most striking ones is an interpretation preserved in the name of Rabbi Shimon ben Yochai in the Midrash called Genesis Rabbah. And the story of Cain and Abel, who, as everybody knows, kill each other, and the blood of Abel is crying out from the ground to God, is taken by Shimon ben Yochai in a very radical and really quite amazing way to really interrogate to what extent God was responsible for this first murder, because he could have split the two brothers and in fact prevented Cain from killing Abel. So in that midrash, the rabbi uses the tradition of the Olympic Games and says God acted like a judge who took pleasure in the violence, and like a judge who didn't care about human lives, but only enjoyed the pleasure of the competition, even up until death. And here again, people who don't have the whole picture in front of them, they could say, oh, here we have the rabbis kind of in a kind of an anti-Greek spirit. But here too, like in Origen, I would argue that Rabbi Shimon ben Yochai, not only did he know this tradition, but he also used it for Bible exegesis in a very positive sense. Mm-hmm. And we have a very similar approach to the judges and their joy in seeing the competition even until death. In Lucian, the satirist, mm-hmm. In his treatise on the games, and there we have a barbarian who comes to the sports ground in Athens and discuss it with a real Greek about the games and mocks them. And one of the things that he mocks, by the way, he also mocks that they only get a parsley wreath as a prize, and this is quite ridiculous also in the eyes of the barbarian, presented in Lucian in a Greek text, ultimately defending the Greek tradition. And also here we have the barbarian who says, oh, look at these judges, they are so happy with violence and they don't really care, and people sometimes even kill each other, and the judges will just stand by and not interfere. And so here again, you can see that the rabbis, they were familiar with these traditions, not only as kind of mythological icons, but also with the kind of ongoing discourse about them. Mm-hmm. And they opted for a pretty similar mocking approach as Lucian did. But this time, in the case of Rabbi Shimon ben Yochai, it is also a very daring question to put to God. In other words, the Greek myth and the Greek tradition of the games has become a vehicle for him to express quite radical criticism about God and to question theodicy, namely the righteousness and the care that one usually expects from God. So I think here again we have this integration of traditions with some criticism, yes, but in the service, ultimately in the service of theology.
It strikes me as you're describing this, both with Origen and with the rabbis, is that they're not that unlike theologians today or ministers today, believers today who try to grapple with their respective positions in relation to the broader world around them. And oftentimes that can emerge as tension, but often a healthy tension, because sometimes the culture around them can help to understand theological concepts and even help them understand the biblical text. I find it a very fascinating discussion that sometimes, even though we're talking about 1800 years difference, not a lot has changed in some of the ways we try to understand ourselves, right? Well, Dr. Niehoff, thank you for a very wonderful conversation. I certainly look forward to the final version of your paper, and also hoping to learn quite a bit more from you about the rabbis in Caesarea as I work on myself through Origen's Caesarean scholarly works. I think those are very important discussions to have. So thank you very much for a very wonderful conversation. And I wish you a very happy weekend.
Same to you. Thanks.
Bye-bye.